Just so you know, sort of like how this came about. So we're all going to Vietnam, and none of us really know a ton about it. So
You want to know a little bit of Vietnamese history and then how the war fits in.
right, exactly. So that when we go there, we understand sort of the greater
Yeah.
context
So
of everything.
I'll say this. I'll start at about 60,000 feet and I'll give you the big picture of what happened.
Yeah,
Okay. And then we can talk about the war itself.
right.
You know, the war is really 65 to 73.
Yeah,
But I'll take you back to 1887 when the French got all of
yeah, that's
Vietnam
perfect. Yeah, that's
up
perfect.
until today. And we should even talk about today and why Vietnam is friendly with the United States.
Yeah,
Okay. I think the first thing you want to know is that Vietnam was colonized by the French. You remember the Europeans used to have these huge empires, the British Empire, the French Empire, the Portuguese Empire. The French had their own empire. And in 1887, Vietnam became part of that empire. And France controlled Vietnam from roughly 1887 to 1940. And what happened in 1940 is that France lost the war in Europe to Germany and lost its empire. And what then happened is that Japan took over Vietnam. Japan invaded North Vietnam in 1940. And then in 1941, shortly before we went to war against Japan, they took the southern half of Vietnam. So during World War II, Vietnam was controlled by Japan. Before the war, right, for not 100 years, but close to 100 years, Vietnam was controlled by France. When Japan was defeated in 1945, the Vietnamese wanted their independence. And that's the first time we began to hear about Ho Chi Minh, who was sort of the canonical figure in North Vietnam during our war with the North. And Ho Chi Minh tried to be very friendly to the United States and get the United States to recognize that the Vietnamese people wanted their own country. The French, on the other hand, wanted to return and take back Vietnam. And of course, the French did that. And the French controlled Vietnam from 1945, when World War II ended, to 1954. But they were defeated in a very famous battle in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu. It was a devastating defeat for the French, and they basically gave up on controlling Vietnam. And the United States moved in to replace the French. Now, in 1954, there was a question whether the United States would use military force. I mean, again, given that the French had been defeated at Dien Bien Phu, would we use military force against the North Vietnamese? And the Eisenhower administration wisely declined to intervene militarily. And we worked out a deal after the French left where Vietnam was broken up into two parts, North Vietnam and South Vietnam.
Separate countries or
Separate countries to start. This is in 1954. Remember, Dien Bien Phu is in 1954. It's the Geneva Agreement of 1954 that divides the North and the South. And everybody agrees that there'll be a vote in 1956, 2 years later, where people get to vote on coming back together and forming one country or keeping two separate countries and so forth.
what was the logic of them having the two separate countries? Were they like different factions of people?
Yes, yes. And of course, this is what fueled the eventual war that we got into the middle of,
Right.
because we were allied with the South Vietnamese.
Gotcha.
And remember, this is the Cold War, so the Russians and the Chinese were allied with the
I
North
see.
Vietnamese.
I see. I see.
Right. But Vietnam is split in 54. And by the way, remember I told you when the Japanese went into Vietnam in 1940, they took the northern half. And then in 1941, they took the southern half.
Before they took the southern half, was it French controlled?
Well, the French had lost in Europe in May of 1940.
Right.
So in very important ways, the Vietnamese controlled the
Okay, so they
South,
were in control of it.
yeah, for a good year. And they controlled North Vietnam for a while before the
I
Japanese
gotcha.
came in.
Gotcha.
And of course, the ultimate goal of the Vietnamese was to control all of Vietnam,
Right.
which is the case today.
Right.
They didn't want a bunch of Europeans or Americans
Right.
coming in and telling them how to do their business.
Right.
This is all about nationalism, which is all about self-determination. But anyway, so the country is divided in 54. There's supposed to be this vote in 56, which is really designed to bring the country together. Not surprisingly, there was no vote in 56. The country remained divided. But what happens after 1954 is that the South Vietnamese government, it's the Diem government, President Diem, D-I-E-M, who is our ally, is basically grossly incompetent. And between 1954 and 1965, the situation in South Vietnam deteriorates. And the balance of power shifts in favor of the North. Okay? And what happens is that we come into the war militarily. We can go into this in greater detail in a while, in 1965. It was in March 1965 when the Marines land at Da Nang that the escalation begins. And then it ends for us in early 1973 after the famous Christmas bombing of
Highland?
1973. The Christmas bombing of 1972. After the Christmas bombing of 1972, the war ends and we get all the prisoners of war back in early 73. And that's the end for us. But North Vietnam and South Vietnam are still divided, even though we're out.
Huh.
Then, in 1975, the North invades the South, captures it, and you have a united Vietnam. And of course, that united Vietnam still exists today. So the basic story, just to go over it, is France controls it from 1887 to 1940. Japan controls it from 1940 to 1945, which is World War II. The French come back and take it from 45 to 54. They're defeated by the North Vietnamese. Then the United States begins to move in. And we don't have to move in militarily from 54 to 65. And then we go in big time in 65. And from 65 to 73, we're up to our eyeballs in alligators in Vietnam. And then we get out, right, following in the footsteps of the French. And then in 75, the North Vietnamese invade. And the end result is that Vietnam is united. And it has remained united ever since.
Huh.
So that's the big picture
Yeah.
in terms of what happened.
Real quick, just when we were in there non-militarily, what were we doing? Were we controlling it in there, or were we just like, what was our sort of?
We had very little control because Diem was not interested in letting us control him.
Right.
And he was basically incompetent as well. And
A dangerous combination.
Yes, it was a deadly combination. Very hard to control and incompetent, even if he will let you.
Right.
And he would not let us. And by the way, what happens in the early 60s is the situation deteriorates so badly that we participate in the coup against Diem, in which he gets assassinated. This is right before President Kennedy is assassinated. Remember, President Kennedy is assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. Right before that, Diem was assassinated. And we had blood on our hands from that. But we got rid of Diem because he was so incompetent. The problem that we faced is that the generals who replaced him, believe it or not, were more incompetent than him. So the end result is we had to go in ourselves.
I see.
And that's why in 1965, you had what was generally referred to at the time as the Americanization of the war.
Gotcha.
And let me just briefly give you the broad outlines of the war
Yeah,
from
please.
our perspective. We went in big time in 65, and we went in with small numbers to begin with. But by 1968, late 68, we had over 550,000 troops there. We had a huge commitment to Vietnam. But there was a very famous attack by the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, and the Vietcong. And I'll talk more about the Vietcong and the North Vietnamese in a minute. But the other side, so to speak, launched a major offensive against us in January, February of 1968. It was called the Tet Offensive.
Mm-hmm.
And although we ultimately won a big military victory, it was seen as a devastating defeat for us. Because we had been there from 65 to 68, and yet by 1968, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were still in a position where they could launch a major offensive against us. People began to think that there's no way we could win the war. This is in early 68. Right? So from 65 to 68, it was an American-run war. 68 is an incredibly tumultuous year in the United States. Anti-war sentiment is remarkably high. President Johnson says he's not going to run for another term. And the end result is that Richard Nixon gets elected. And we then turn to Vietnamization of the war. So from 65 to 68, it's an American-run war, which was a huge mistake. We should have been building up the Vietnamese forces to fight effectively.
Right.
We started to do that after 68, but truth be told, it was too late.
Yeah.
So from 68 up to 73, the Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, are fighting the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, and they're basically incompetent. The North Vietnamese are a much more formidable fighting force, as are the Viet Cong. And that's why the South Vietnamese lose after we leave. Again, we leave in January 73. Now, excuse me, let me say just a few words about who the principal participants were in this fight. First of all, there were the South Vietnamese. Their army was called the ARVN, A-R-V-N, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Very incompetent. Then there were the North Vietnamese regular army units, greatly respected by virtually every American who fought over there. And then there were the Viet Cong, who were people who lived in the South, who were allied with North Vietnam and hated the Vietnamese government. So the Americans who were allied with the South Vietnamese, with ARVN, were fighting two enemies. The Viet Cong, or sometimes referred to as the Viet Minh, who were the indigenous forces in South Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese regular units that would come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail into South Vietnam and who we would engage in big battles.
Yeah.
So there were some huge battles involving tanks and helicopters, big divisions, big brigades, almost like World War II battles. And those involved American mainline infantry and armored units up against the equivalent forces from the North. At the same time, we were involved in a very nasty guerrilla war or counterinsurgency with the Viet Cong. Right. So those were sort of the key actors. But on top of them, the North Vietnamese were aided by the Chinese and by the Soviets. Remember, this is the Cold War, and this is when communism is alive and well. North Vietnam is a communist state. The Chinese and the Soviets are communists. So they're aiding the North Vietnamese.
Yeah.
And remember, at this point in time, by the time the war begins to heat up in Vietnam, the Russians or the Soviets and the Chinese hate each other. And they're competing with each other to aid the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese. So there's a lot of aid coming into North.
Is that where all of their artillery and tanks and all of that is supplied by one of the two, China?
Yes.
In these larger battles?
Yes, yeah. And in fact, when you go to Haiphong was the harbor. There were two big cities in the north. And we bombed these cities throughout the war, especially in the Christmas bombing of December 72. But Hanoi, which is more inland, and Haiphong, which is right on the coast.
Mm-hmm.
And what the Soviets and the Chinese would do is they'd send ships into Haiphong Harbor. And we had big debates late about whether or not to mine Haiphong Harbor. Because if you mine Haiphong Harbor and you blow up some Soviet or Chinese ships, the consequences might not be nice.
Right.
But anyway, the North Vietnamese were getting assistance from both China and the Soviet Union. And of course, the South Vietnamese were getting assistance from us. And by the way, you're talking about the supplies that are coming from the Soviet Union and coming from China. They'll go to places like Haiphong and Hanoi, come overland to Hanoi, and then they're run down into South Vietnam through the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Mm.
The Ho Chi Minh Trail goes through Laos and Cambodia, and then it comes into South Vietnam at different points. And the United States spent an enormous amount of time bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail and sending teams onto the trail to try and kill people and stop the traffic that was coming down. They were called LRPs, Long Range Reconnaissance Patrols. They'd send LRP teams onto the trail. It never worked. The trail was an incredibly complicated network of roads and trails, some of it paved. And the North Vietnamese were able to provide a steady flow of equipment, food, and other supplies to the South to keep the Vietcong and their regular units going. So that was sort of the basic outline of the story. Now, I think what happened in the war is that the American units won almost every battle that they were engaged in. As people used to say at the time, we won all the battles and lost the war.
Yeah.
But what the North Vietnamese had to do was just hang on. And this, of course, is true of the Viet Cong as well. The two of them. They just had to hang on and inflict lots of casualties on the American forces and not lose. And eventually, American public opinion would turn against the war and force who was ever president to pull the troops out, or at least greatly reduce them, and put the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong in a position where they could win the war. We used to say at the time, the North Vietnamese just have to make sure they don't lose to win the war.
Right.
They don't have to win the war by winning decisive victories over the American forces the way they won the Battle of Dien Bien Phu against the French. They could defeat the French at Dien Bien Phu, but it was almost impossible to defeat the American military because we had so much power projection capability. And in fact, there was a battle at Khe Sanh that was very similar to the Battle of Dien Bien Phu that we did not lose. But we eventually ended up losing well over 50,000 Americans dead and many more wounded. And people turned against the war, big time. And I would say that there were two reasons that people turned against the war. First of all, we had a draft. And when you have a draft and you're sort of sweeping all sorts of people off the street and into the military, it's not long before you're going to have a lot of disenchanted people.
Yeah.
Or you're going to have some senator's son or some governor's son, right, who's going to be turned into a trigger puller. And that senator or governor is not going to be very happy. Or if it's the son of an important person at the New York Times or the Washington Post, the parents are not going to be happy. So the fact that we had a draft made the war very unpopular very quickly.
Was the draft the first and only draft in the U.S.?
No. The United States had a rich history of a draft.
Yeah, I thought so.
We had a draft in World War II, and
yeah.
we had a draft after World War II. We had a draft for the Korean War, and we had a draft before the Vietnam War started. It was in place.
So why did it become so popular? Just because basically so many people were being killed,
Unpopular.
sort of over. Or, I'm sorry, so unpopular because
Well, it became
so many
unpopular because lots of people died, and people who had voice died. Today, most of the people who are in the all-volunteer military don't have much voice. I've often said you would have never had a war in Iraq, and you wouldn't have all these crazy wars in the Middle East if we had a draft.
Yeah.
Right? Because the elite would not allow Johnny and now Susie to go fight those kinds of wars.
Right.
But you have an all-volunteer military, so you can fight these wars.
Yeah.
But you did not have an all-volunteer military then. Right? You had a draft. And that meant that you could not stay there for a long period of time and sustain significant casualties. And the North Vietnamese and the Vietcong were really tough hombres.
Yeah.
When I was at West Point, and people would come back through the barracks, people who had been in earlier classes and who had served in Vietnam, you never heard anyone not pay the highest respect to the North Vietnamese and the Vietcong, and at the same time have nothing but contempt for our allies, the South Vietnamese forces.
Right.
So we were up against some really tough hombres. There was no question about that. And we killed many more of them than they killed of us. We had tremendous firepower, and we used it. But nevertheless, they hung in there. It was like, Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali going 15 rounds. They just hung in there. So that's the first thing that happened. That happened in the context of the draft. The second thing that happened is that people began to question why we were there. Right? At first, people said that we were fighting communism. And that what this was really all about was the famous domino theory. And the domino theory said that if we lost in Vietnam, then Cambodia would fall, Thailand would fall, Japan would fall, Singapore would fall, Australia would fall, France would fall, Germany would fall. Communism would spread all over the globe, and there'd be no country left that wasn't communist except us. And that would not be a good thing, and ultimately we'd be the last domino. Now, the domino theory was nuts, and the idea that we believed that losing in Vietnam was going to have this ripple effect is hard to believe in retrospect, but we believed it at the time we went in. So lots of people thought that we had to stand up to communism, that it was a mortal threat, and if we lost in Vietnam, it would have significant implications for our position all over the planet. So we fought like wild dogs. But as the war wore on, people began to realize that what we were dealing with was not communism as an adversary. We were dealing with nationalism. And what the Vietnamese wanted was control over their own country. They wanted self-determination. They did not want a bunch of Americans or a bunch of Japanese or a bunch of French running their country. And we began to realize that we were fighting nationalism, not communism. And this was crazy. And we also began to realize that who won in Vietnam just didn't matter very much. What was going to happen if the dominoes don't fall? And we concluded eventually that the dominoes were not going to fall. Who cares whether the North Vietnamese unite South Vietnam? This is a poor country in the middle of Southeast Asia. This is not Germany or the Soviet Union or Japan. It's not one of these big, rich, powerful countries like we fought in World War II or World War I. This is a really small country. And if it's united, it's not going to cause us a lot of problems. And by the way, when they finally won the war in 1975, it didn't cause us any problems. And by the way, this is quite remarkable. In 1979, the Vietnamese win in 75. 4 years later, in 1979, China invades North Vietnam. And the North Vietnamese whack the Chinese on the snout. They give the Chinese a good beating. Because again, as I told you, the North Vietnamese military, not to be underestimated, at least in those days. I don't know what it looks like now. Right? But you saw the Chinese, a communist country, ended up fighting North Vietnam, a communist country, or Vietnam at that point in time, a communist country. And by the way, as I told you before, you had the Sino-Soviet split. The Chinese and the Soviets hated each other. They were both communist countries. So this whole idea of a domino effect had gone out the window. Everybody realized Vietnam didn't matter. And it wasn't like we had an all-volunteer military that was losing 2,000 or 3,000 people over time. We had a military that was based on the draft that had lost over 55,000 people. So it became wildly unpopular. The problem we faced was we were so deeply committed. Remember, I told you that by the end of '68, we've got over 550,000 troops there. Winding down those 550,000 troops is not going to be easy. And because we failed to do Vietnamization from '65 to '68, we really have an incentive to stay and try to train up the Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, so they can stand on their own.
Yeah.
See, we foolishly didn't train them up in 65. We didn't start doing that until 68. So it's too late.
Because we thought it would be so easy to go in and manage it, or it was just poorly planned?
I think it was poorly planned. Yeah. I think that we probably thought that we could whoop the North Vietnamese and we could whoop the Vietcong, and the South Vietnamese would be okay. I don't think that we foresaw things going as badly as they did. But just to tell you a story on that, this is a very important piece of the story. As I said, the Marines went to Da Nang in March 65, and then by Christmas 65, we really have a significant buildup. By the way, I went into the U.S. Army in June of 65. And in June of 65, when I went to basic training at Fort Dix, it was very clear to everybody who was in my basic training company who was a draftee. If you were a draftee, you did not have any control over what was called your MOS, your military occupational specialty. Right? The way it worked is if you got drafted, you were in for 2 years, and you had no control over the job or your MOS.
Yeah.
If you enlisted, you went in for 3 years, and you had control over your MOS. You could become a clerk, typist, or truck driver.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were drafted, you became, in most cases, what was called an 11 Bravo, a 11B, which is a light weapons infantryman, which is another way of saying you become a trigger puller.
Yeah.
And that meant you went to Vietnam and you were put in the frontline unit. So when I went to basic training in 65, summer of 65, June, July, August, everybody talked, right, about what was going to happen to them. And all the draftees understood full well that they'd be sent to Vietnam. And they were, by the way. And they participated in the big search and destroy operations that we ran, which were quite deadly. But anyway, to get back to the story, what happens is that the numbers ramp up, and by late 65, we have a lot of troops over there. And of course, General Westmoreland, who's in control, wants more troops, because to win this war, he's going to need a lot of troops. So he's constantly asking for more and more. But there's little evidence of success throughout 66, and even throughout 67. And a number of people in the media, people like David Halberstam, who wrote for the New York Times, and assorted other folks in the media, were beginning to raise questions about whether this was a winnable war. So in the fall of 1967, President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, had General Westmoreland, who was the head of MACV, he was the big American honcho in South Vietnam, come back to the United States and give a talk to the American people about where we stood. And he said that he could see a light at the end of the tunnel. But what he didn't know was that light was an oncoming train. He thought that we were going to win the war. And he told the American people that in the fall of 67. And that did a great deal to quell dissent. But what happened in early 1968, as I said before, is that the Viet Cong mainly, but also the North Vietnamese, launched the Tet Offensive. It was a stunning offensive. We ultimately won it militarily. But the fact that they were capable of launching this offensive, the Tet Offensive, after General Westmoreland had said that he saw victory ahead, he saw a light at the end of the tunnel, right, really hurt the cause, hurt the war cause. And that's when support for the war just evaporated. And by the way, on March 31st, 1968, I remember it very well, and of course it's your birthday, many years before you were on the planet, of course. But on March 31st, 1968, I remember the date, President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, said that he would not run for office. Now, I was at West Point. I was in the Army from 65 to 66. And then I was at West Point from July 1st, 1966, until I graduated on June 3rd, 1970. But on March 31st, 1968, I remember very well where I was when Johnson gave the speech. I was down in the basement of our barracks, and there was a radio that was broadcasting the speech, and lots of people were listening, me included. And Johnson, in a very defeatist tone, said that he would not run for another term. This was shocking. 4 years earlier, he had won one of the great landslide victories in American politics. This was in November 1964. Here he is in March 1968, a defeated man saying he's not going to run for the president. And it was at that point, for really the first time, I knew that the war was lost. Right? If you're in a place like West Point, you tend to be patriotic. You know, it's people you went to West Point with who were serving over there, and you kind of want to win. I mean, we didn't have any really deep-seated commitment to the war. Most of the cadets were young and foolish and not that serious about international politics. But we were the good guys, and lots of people we knew were fighting over there, and we wanted to win. And I think up until Johnson gave that speech, in my case, I thought there was some possibility we would win. I was remarkably foolish. It was just dead wrong, but it's the way I thought at the time. Anyway, Johnson said that he wouldn't run, and that then led to an election campaign that brought in people like Bobby Kennedy, Eugene McCarthy, and then over on the Republican side, Richard Nixon, George Romney, who was Mitt Romney's father. And in the end, we ended up with Humphrey against Nixon, and Nixon won. But 68 was an incredibly tumultuous year.
When they ran, did they both run on anti-war platforms, or was that ever like a point of debate?
They both did, but not really. Johnson would not let Humphrey distance himself from his policies, from Johnson's policies. The election in November 68 between Nixon and Humphrey was remarkably close. It was remarkably close. Nixon won by a hair. Most people at the time, and I think since, believe that if Johnson had given Humphrey running room and allowed Humphrey, who was quite liberal and quite anti-war deep down inside, to oppose the war, that he would have beaten Nixon. But Johnson would not give him an inch of daylight. And Johnson was a ruthless politician. He made it clear to Humphrey that if he tried to distance himself on Vietnam, he'd basically decapitate him. So Humphrey was not much of an anti-war candidate. And Nixon kind of pretended to be. He said he had a secret plan to end the war, but he had no secret plan. And by 68, certainly by November 68, almost everybody understood two things. One, there was no clever strategy for winning the war. Indeed, there was no strategy for winning the war. And two, if we didn't get out of that place sooner rather than later, it was going to tear the United States apart. That's how bad it was in 68. But anyway, they had this close campaign. Nixon won. And Nixon had no choice but to abandon the Americanization of the war. In fact, Johnson had already started that process. And we moved towards Vietnamization after 68. And Nixon and company scrambled like crazy to, train up and supply and arm the South Vietnamese forces so that they could stand on their own for that day in the future when Uncle Sam was not there to protect them. And they had to face a full onslaught from the North Vietnamese especially, and from the Vietcong as well. And we made a mighty effort in that regard, but we failed. And this is why after we left in 73, the Vietnamese could barely hang on, and finally South Vietnamese could barely hang on, and why in 75 they went down the tubes.
Mm-hmm. And so that when did the war officially end? Like, when did we actually pull out? Like, when was the U.S. officially out?
I'm not sure what the official date was. I think that we signed the agreement either in late 72 or early January 73. It's either very late December 72, early 73, but we were effectively on our way out anyway. If you look at the West Point classes, this is a good indicator. I was in the class of 1970. By the way, the classes that suffered the greatest casualties, as is almost always the case, are the West Point classes that graduate just as the war is starting.
Right.
So the class of 1966 suffered the greatest number of casualties, or the greatest percentage of casualties for the class. 65 and 67 were right behind it. Mm-hmm. My class was the last class to go to Vietnam. And the reason is that if you graduated in June 70, as we all did, you had to spend 1 year training. You went to Ranger School, you went to Jump School, you went to Infantry Officer Basic Course or Armored Officer Basic Course, things like this. And it took you roughly a year to get trained up. So that would bring you to sometime late in the summer or fall of 71. Yeah. But the war is over with by late 72. And even if you go in 71, let's say you go in August 71, you're going over, but most of the troops are coming back the other way, right, because we're pulling out.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question was it sort of mostly a pulling out, slowly just taking troops back?
Absolutely, yes.
But they were still also sending new troops there?
Yeah. We had a system then. It's very interesting how we fought the war. We fought the war by sending people over for roughly a year. I think the tours were 13 months, if my memory is correct. It was either 12 months or 13 months. And we had a system that was called individual replacement. So let's just assume you were a 19-year-old who got drafted in 1966, right? You go to basic training, then you go to advanced infantry training. They'd make you an 11 Bravo, and then they'd send you to Vietnam as an individual. And when you got over there, they would decide whether to send you to the 101st Airborne or send you to the 1st Infantry Division. Okay. Today, we have a much smarter system where you become part of a unit. Let's say you become part of a brigade in the 101st Airborne, and you work and live with the people in that brigade. You go over with them, you fight with them, you come back, and if you go again, you go with them. Now, this is not to say that people in the unit don't retire and that new people don't come in, because they do. But you maintain the unit integrity. And you have a sense that you're part of an enterprise, that you're with buddies. And there's all sorts of research that shows that people fight in combat situations for their buddies. It's that small unit cohesion argument. But back to Vietnam. One of the reasons that the war became so unpopular, not just back in the United States, but among the soldiers over there as well, because you had an individual replacement system. But anyway, what was happening after 68, when Vietnamization set in, is that the Nixon administration was slowly but steadily pulling people out. But they still had to send people over there, right, to keep enough new soldiers in the fight so that we didn't lose all of a sudden.
So there was still fighting going on up until the time that we left, because the South and North Vietnam were fighting even after we left.
Well, there was fighting even involving the United States after 68 in a big way. And even in 72, when the numbers of American ground forces had been greatly reduced, there was lots of fighting. There's no question that the United States, when it fights wars, likes to substitute firepower for manpower. We like to fight industrial wars because the idea is that if you can use a lot of shrapnel to kill the adversary, then you won't have to send your own troops to do the killing and risk the chance that large numbers of them will get killed. So we used a lot of artillery, and we especially used a lot of air power. And as the war moved along and became more and more unpopular, the Nixon administration had powerful incentives to keep the number of casualties as low as possible. So what we did was we relied more on firepower. But there were limits to what you could do with firepower, and we continued to get involved in firefights. And a good number of my West Point classmates, again, my class was the last class to go to Vietnam, a good number of my classmates were actually killed in firefights or in some sort of combat operations. Now, let's come at this from a slightly different angle. In addition to fighting a ground war in the South with mainly the U.S. Army, but also the Marines, we waged a massive air war, not only in the South, but in the North as well. So when you go to Hanoi and Haiphong, you will see all sorts of evidence of that air war. I've talked on a number of occasions in this conversation about the famous Christmas bombing of December 1972. Okay, this is we went up there with B-52s in large numbers, and we really pounded both Hanoi and Haiphong. And then shortly thereafter, the war just completely ended. But we were bombing North Vietnam long before the Christmas bombing. And if you go near Hanoi, you'll see a mountain ridge. It was famously known at the time as Thud Ridge. Thuds were F-105s. That was the nickname of an F-105. It was called a Thud. And what the 105s would do is they come in behind Hanoi, and then they come down Thud Ridge. It's called Thud Ridge, this mountain range. And they hug the terrain as closely as possible so that the North Vietnamese radars could not pick them up. And of course, the North Vietnamese, because they had all that help from the Chinese and especially the Soviets, who were giving them surface-to-air missiles and AAA, that's anti-aircraft artillery, shot down a lot of our planes on Thud Ridge. And by the way, John McCain was shot down when he was flying a mission, I believe, to bomb Hanoi. Right? But he was one of many. And in fact, when the war ends in early 73, one of the first things that happens is that the prisoners of war, almost all of whom were pilots who were shot down, including John McCain, are released by the North Vietnamese. They had been in a place that was frequently referred to at the time as the Hanoi Hilton. And of course, life in the Hanoi Hilton was remarkably unpleasant. John McCain's father, by the way, was a Navy admiral, and he was the commander at one point of all of the forces in the Pacific, including those forces that were fighting against the North Vietnamese and the Vietcong. He was what was called the CINC-PAC, C-I-N-C-P-A-C, and that meant Commander-in-Chief Pacific. So John McCain's father, whose name was also John McCain, was the CINC-PAC. So when the North Vietnamese got a hold of John McCain, the son, and he was a POW, they understood that they had the CINC-PAC's son.
Oh, they knew that.
They knew that, yeah. And they actually offered at one point to allow him to go back to the United States. This is before the war ended. And he refused because he felt that they were doing it because he was a special person.
Wow.
But he refused. But it was a terrible time for all of those POWs, as you can imagine. Sure. But you'll see all sorts of evidence of where we bombed those two big cities. We bombed all over the country. You want to understand that because the United States substituted firepower for manpower whenever we could, that we killed huge numbers of Vietnamese. It's hard to come up with a precise number, but if you Google around, you'll see that the number is probably somewhere between 2 and 3 million people. This is really remarkable. The amount of punishment that we inflicted on North Vietnam and on the Vietcong is just hard to imagine. And what makes it especially hard to comprehend, is in the end it didn't matter at all. It didn't matter at all because we lost, but it didn't matter at all because the Vietnamese should have been free to determine for themselves whether they wanted to have one country or two countries. It was just none of our business. And it had no strategic consequences for us, as I said to you before. Of course, this is why the war became so unpopular, because people began to realize this. Not only are huge numbers of Americans dying, not only are all these boys being drafted, but we're fighting a war that's unnecessary.
Yeah.
And furthermore, we're killing huge numbers of Vietnamese in the process. So once public opinion turned, it became almost impossible to sustain the conflict. By the way, everybody knows about Watergate and what happened to Richard Nixon as a result. Remember, he's reelected in November '72. Just think about that. The war ends right after the Christmas bombing in December '72. Nixon gets reelected in November '72. Nixon is paranoid at the time, in large part because he has a siege mentality. He feels like being in the White House is like being in a bunker. And it makes perfect sense if you knew how crazy the country was in 1972. I often tell people that in 1970, just to go back to when I graduated from West Point, we invaded Cambodia on May 1st, I think, 1970. But there was the famous incident in Kent State on May 4th, 1970, where the Ohio National Guard killed a number of Kent State students. And the country erupted again. It caused a huge amount of trouble in the country. That was on May 4th, 1970, Kent State.
Yeah.
And again, I think we invaded Cambodia on May 1st, which is what spurred all the protests, including the protests at at Kent State. Anyway, I graduated, my class graduates on June 3rd, 1970, roughly 1 month later. And the speaker at my graduation is Spiro Agnew, who was a real lightning rod. He was the vice president, and he had nothing but contempt for the protesters, was a strong supporter of the war. And he was a real attack dog, and he was the speaker. And that day, June 3rd, 1970, when I graduated from West Point, there were government snipers on every roof, right? And they brought up, I think, 2 battalions from the 82nd Airborne, put them in civilian clothes, and asked them to infiltrate the crowd in case they had some crowd control problems. As it turned out, nothing happened. But it just gives you a sense of how crazy it was.
Yeah.
And that craziness, I believe, is in good part what made Nixon so paranoid about his chances for re-election in 1972. Of course, he was remarkably foolish. Right? If he had read Scammon and Wattenberg, who wrote a very famous book at the time called The Real Majority, he would have known that he was going to win a landslide victory, which is what he did. But he was not smart enough to do that. He was paranoid because he thought he was in the bunker. And you got Watergate. And that led to his undoing in 1974. It's August 1974. Less than 2 years after he wins another victory against the Democrats, he's forced from office. Just a real tragedy. But I think in good part, a lot of that was just fallout from the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
It just destroyed a lot of people's lives. It destroyed Lyndon Johnson's life. Right? This is a guy in 1964 who won one of the greatest landslide victories in American history. He was in the driver's seat. This is one of the greatest politicians the United States ever had. Right? And nevertheless, he went into Vietnam, and he ended up leaving office in disgrace. He was a broken man, and he died a few years later. Right? Very similar, not completely, but very similar to George Bush, George W. Bush, when he went into Iraq. If he had not gone into Iraq, he would have been much better off as president, and he would have, I believe, stepped down in January 2009, a much more successful president than he was. He made a huge blunder. Now, this raises the question that we want to talk a little bit about of how we got into the war. I remember when I was a cadet, we used to march in Armed Forces Day parades in New York City. And whenever we marched, not the first spring, that was 67. The second spring, remember, I went in on July 1st, 1966. I think it was May, we had Armed Forces Day Parade in New York, and West Point cadets went down and marched. So my first time marching was May 67. Things were pretty quiet then. There was no problem. The next time we went was May 68. I remember how crazy 1968 was. And then 69 we went, and then 70 went. Oh my God. There were protesters all over the place, right? There would be these police horses, the wooden police horses on both sides of Fifth Avenue. There'd be police all over the place. The protesters would be screaming at us, throwing bags of urine, bags of pig's blood. And we'd have to drill endlessly before we went down to New York City to make sure that nobody overreacted if somebody broke through and attacked us. It was really just crazy. But anyway, I tell you that because I often used to think to myself when we would go down to New York and march in those Armed Forces Day parades, how did this ever happen? How did we end up in this crazy war? It's one of those things you just sort of say to yourself, this is the United States of America. We have all these educated people. This is not supposed to happen. But I think what's most amazing about the decision to go in, and remember, the decision is made in early 65. It's really late 64, early 65. Remember, the Marines go in at Da Nang, March 65. What's really amazing is that President Johnson and his lieutenants knew that we were jumping into quicksand. In fact, the reason we went in was because the South Vietnamese were so incompetent. So it's not like we were going in just to buttress them up and they just needed a little bit of help, a little fixing on the margins. These were massively incompetent fighting forces that we were coming in to replace, right? This is not our country. So they understood, Johnson and Company, this was going to be really tough. And maybe it was unwinnable. They knew that before they went in. So you sort of say to yourself, what were they thinking? And I think it's quite clear at this point in time that there were two reasons they went in, especially Johnson. Johnson was the king. The first was domestic politics. Johnson was scared stiff that if he didn't go in, we would lose the war, and the Democrats, and in particular him, would be blamed for losing the war. In the early 1950s, right, the Republicans blamed Harry Truman. They even blamed George Marshall for losing China because China became a communist country. And anytime a country became communist, we were accused of losing it, or the Democrats were accused of losing it because they were usually in the White House at that time, as if we owned these countries to begin with, which we didn't. So Johnson lived in mortal fear. It's irrational, but he did. He lived in mortal fear that we'd lose in Vietnam and he'd be accused of being soft on communism and responsible for that devastating defeat. And he was not going to let that happen. That's the first reason. Second reason is one I alluded to before. It was the domino theory. Johnson, his lieutenants, actually believed that if the communists won in Vietnam, that would allow the communists to win in other countries. And it would become increasingly difficult as the dominoes continued to fall to contain communism. So they felt that fighting in Vietnam was, in effect, like defending Europe or defending Japan. Vietnam was the first line of defense. And if it fell, there'd be another line of defense. So if you didn't fight in Vietnam, you'd have to fight in Cambodia. If you didn't fight in Cambodia, you'd have to fight in Thailand. It was that kind of thing. And that was a powerful selling point at the time, and the elites believed in it. So President Johnson dragged us in. I'll make a couple points that are very important here. The French, who originally owned the place, and had been defeated at Dien Bien Phu, told us, do not go in. Charles de Gaulle, very famous man, Charles de Gaulle was in charge in France at the time. De Gaulle warned us, do not go in. The New York Times and the liberal media said, don't go in. In those days, the South was controlled by the Democratic Party, and there were all sorts of very conservative Senate Democrats and House Democrats, very powerful people like Richard Russell from Georgia, who were good friends with Johnson, bosom buddies with Johnson, who told him, don't go in. There were a lot of people who smelled really big trouble here, who smelled a potential catastrophe. Right? So it wasn't like Johnson was being egged on. There were a lot of doubters. But Johnson was a very tough guy. And when he got it in his head that he was going to do something, he did it. And he basically mau-maued a lot of those people. There was one guy in the administration, very famous, George Ball, who was a big buckety-buck in the State Department, who wrote some very famous memos arguing against the war. He said, he wrote a memo, it was called the Riding the Tiger's Back memo, where he said that going into Vietnam was going to be like riding the back of a tiger. And he said, the tiger decides when you get off, not you. And but what the bureaucracy did, especially what Johnson did, was they just crushed Ball. They crushed all the dissenters. And they were very effective at that. And then they told people like, Richard Russell in the Senate and Charles de Gaulle and others, they believed they were wrong. Let me just have a quick swig of my water here, and that we would ultimately prevail. Again, what's paradoxical about this is they fully understood that we were jumping into a quagmire, that this is not a promising military situation. So it was not terribly smart to think that we would prevail. And of course we didn't.
Yeah. Johnson was kind of famous, right, for being a bit of a political bully.
Oh yeah, yeah. He was a world-class bully. There's no question about that. No question about that. He had been a very powerful figure in the Senate before he became vice president, and he got used to pushing people around. He's a very manipulative individual. He's brilliantly manipulative. And also, you want to remember, as I said, he won a stunning victory in 1964. And that gave him a sense of power. Right. Just to switch subjects here, you want to remember that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were enormously important for ending Jim Crow in this country and ending the really deep-seated racism that was laced into the American system in the North and certainly in the South. Monumental legislation in terms of improving the lot of blacks in this country. That's the Civil Rights Act in 64 and the Voting Rights Act in 65. You want to remember that Lyndon Johnson was president. He had just won a stunning victory, and that's what allowed him to get the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act through Congress. He did it, not single-handedly, but he was of enormous importance. Yeah. And that's a case where his effective bullying paid real dividends, because those were wonderful events.
So that sort of takes us to through the war, how we got there, what happened, and so then we leave, and then what's sort of the next chapter?
Well, we leave in early '73, and we're still, everybody in the country is watching what will happen. We feel, at least most Americans feel like we have a certain moral commitment to the South Vietnamese, especially given all the Vietnamization that has taken place. Now, there's no question there's a slice of the country that just wants to completely wash its hands of this war and not pay any attention to what happens. But for the most part, American elites and the public are watching. And in '75, the North Vietnamese invade and South Vietnam falls. It's a devastating defeat. not only for the South Vietnamese, for us. And at that point in time, the last thing the United States wants to do is think about ever fighting a war like that. So what we do is we focus laser-like on Europe and NATO and the NATO-Warsaw Pact conventional balance and things like that. And nobody's thinking about fighting any more wars in places like Vietnam. And of course, given all the Vietnamese we killed and the fact that we lost the war, we don't have any warm feelings towards the Vietnamese, and they don't have any warm feelings towards us. We kind of dislike each other intensely. Maybe it's fair to say we hate each other. But one, with the passage of time, and two, with the changing geopolitical landscape over time, we actually developed quite close relations with Vietnam. And this is what does it, the rise of China. Remember I told you, the war in Southeast Asia between the United States and North Vietnam and the Vietcong, that war ends in 75. In 1979, China invaded North Vietnam, and they had a war. And I told you that the Vietnamese kicked butt. Okay, Vietnamese not to be fooled around with. So this just points out that the Chinese and the Vietnamese do not like each other. And there's a rich history here that goes back over time. I'm just talking about the tip of the iceberg in 1979. Okay. But when the Cold War ends in 1989, at that point in time, China is beginning its impressive economic rise, which continues throughout the 1990s and through the early 2000s. China is becoming more and more powerful, and its foreign policy goals are becoming more and more ambitious. And they're talking about controlling almost completely bodies of water like the South China Sea, where the Vietnamese have claims of their own. So the Vietnamese are becoming increasingly scared of China after the end of the Cold War, as are the United States. What that means, this is balance of power politics 101, is that when you have a common threat, which is China, you should expect Vietnam and the Americans to come together.
You get over that dislike pretty quickly when it's...
Exactly. You know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's that kind of thing. I remember, I think it was in the 1990s, the late 90s, I'm not sure the exact date, I heard on the radio one day that the Vietnamese were asking us if we wanted to station naval forces at Da Nang, the naval base, the old naval base at Da Nang. I was shocked. I couldn't believe that this was happening. And it took me about 2 or 3 days to realize that it made perfect sense, because what the Vietnamese wanted was the Americans in Vietnam, because the Vietnamese wanted us to be allied with them, just the way the South Vietnamese back in the day wanted us to be allied with them. Right? So if you look at U.S. Vietnamese relations, you know, over the past 15 years, this is government to government level, they've improved significantly. And I believe with the rise of China, they'll continue to improve because of the Chinese threat. If China were to collapse tomorrow, I don't think that's going to happen, but if it were to collapse tomorrow, relations between the Vietnamese and the Americans might not be so good.
Yeah. Just to jump back for a second, after we left and the countries were still divided and we were out of the South for all intents and purposes, and the North eventually took the South, what was the situation and timeline for that portion of the sort of the bringing together of Vietnam?
Well, we're completely out by 73. And the North Vietnamese invade in the summer of 75. So it's a year and a half later. The Vietnamese had actually invaded in May 72. Okay, let's just sort of talk this one through. Remember, the war doesn't end until January 73. Late 72, early 73. Okay, that's when the war ends, officially. We're out. But in May 72, the the North Vietnamese invaded the South. And that's because there were so few Americans left. Remember, we talked about how the Americans were coming out in large numbers. So the number of ground troops in the South in May 72, very small. Nevertheless, we stopped the North Vietnamese offensive in its track, and we do it with air power. Remember, I told you the Americans are always looking to substitute firepower for manpower. The manpower we used to stop the North Vietnamese is the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN forces. Okay, so it's South Vietnamese ground power and American air power in droves, right, that stops the May 72, the Spring Offensive, Spring 72 North Vietnamese offensive. Okay, and they get beaten up. The North Vietnamese get beaten up very badly. Then the war ends at the end of 72, early 73. Okay, that's about 8 months later. And the North Vietnamese have to regroup. They just can't invade again because they've done it in May 72 and got whacked good by Uncle Sam and, to a lesser extent, the South Vietnamese ground forces. So after January 73, they have to rebuild their forces, train them up, and bring them back down, and then go on the offensive. And they do that in the summer of 75. At that point, Congress has said no American air power, right? Many people believe that if we had used American air power in 75, the way we used American air power in 1972, we used it in the summer of 75, the way we did in the spring of 72, we would have stopped the North Vietnamese.
So we essentially just let it happen.
Yes.
We say that's
That's correct.
and that's a quick victory for the North at that
That was
point.
a quick victory, yeah. The fact that Congress mandated that we could do nothing militarily, could not even use air power to help the South Vietnamese, is just evidence of how sick and tired of the war everybody was. We just wanted to wash our hands of it, get out, and never do it again.
And so then that happens quickly, and then fast forward through all of this time to when does the U.S. Vietnamese relationship sort of shift? Just to kind of bring us back to sort of the current day. Yeah, when does it improve? When does it become that we're allies because China has become so powerful?
Well, we begin to get quite friendly in the mid-1990s.
So not until the 90s, really.
Oh yeah, not until the 90s.
I always, in my mind, it was always earlier than that, not for any logical reason. But.
No, I mean, we had hardly any dealings from 70, let's say from 75 to 95, about a 20-year period. We didn't have many dealings with the Vietnamese. I mean, there are a lot of bad feelings left over from the war. First of all, we just didn't want to get involved in Southeast Asia. I mean, that was the last thing you wanted to do. So there were, not a lot of contacts, and to the extent that there were contacts, there were, quite a bit of bad feelings. But then that began to change, slowly but steadily. And, you had also a lot of generational change.
Yeah.
A lot of the people who were moving into positions of responsibility had not served in Vietnam, or if they had been, in lower level positions. I mean, John Kerry, who ran for president, had been in quite a bit of combat in Vietnam, but Bill Clinton had avoided the draft. George W. Bush, although he was in the Air National Guard, had effectively avoided the draft. Mitt Romney didn't serve.
Sure.
So if you sort of look at the American elite, most of the people had not served in Vietnam, or if they did, they were not in positions of influence. Al Gore, by the way, served in Vietnam. Bill Clinton's vice president. Yeah. He was a journalist over there. So
time passes.
Time passes, yeah. And that famous saying, time heals all wounds.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that time healed all wounds in this case, but it healed a lot of them.
Sure.
And I think there's no question that the rise of China has gone a long way towards getting both the United States and the Vietnamese not to think about those wounds and to concentrate on present-day problems.
Yeah, I mean, and even sort of the reasoning behind us having this conversation is because I know so little about it as someone of my generation, because it's sort of so far in the past.
Exactly. I mean, if you go to Vietnam and you meet some young person who's roughly your age, the Vietnam War has no meaning for you. For someone like me, although I did not serve in Vietnam, but who was deeply enmeshed in the American military from 65 to 75, the Vietnam War just has, enormous meaning. It was a profound experience for me at a very young age. And there's all sorts of literature in this scholarly world that I operate in that shows that when people are involved in events that are tumultuous and have huge consequences, that their brain, they get templates or theories in their head about how the world works that flow from those events. And so I think I'm a person who's heavily influenced by Vietnam. I have a very good friend. He's probably about 10 years older than me, who fought in Vietnam, shot a couple times, highly decorated. And he told me he just couldn't go back. It'd be just too painful for him. So if you contrast him with you can see the difference.
Yeah.
And of course, with the passage of time, there'll eventually be, I hate to say this, no people left who were alive, from 1965 to 1975.
Yeah. Well, we're counting on you to hold out.